Hello all, and welcome to our first literature lecture of the summer 2020 World of Roman course. Normally in these lectures, I will provide you some background information on the assigned literature, always found in the Oxford Anthology of Roman Literature, including information about the author, as well as certain passages that stand out as very important. Today, we did not have any literature to read, but instead read the introduction to the Oxford Anthology titled The Roman World of Books. This introduction traces how Roman literature was read and disseminated in the ancient world, and through this, how it comes to us as evidence of life in ancient Rome. In this lecture, I want to discuss the difference between literature as evidence and material evidence, and what each medium can tell us. First, I will discuss the development and writers of literature that exist today from ancient Rome. The Roman world of books was coextensive with the Roman Empire. Roman soldiers would carry literature with them wherever in the empire they were posted. Hence, we find remnants of literature as far north as Britain and as far south as Egypt. And the origins of Roman literature were just as diverse. In fact, Roman literature began as translations and adaptations of Greek literature. This includes adaptations of Greek comedy to the Roman stage, as well as Livius Andronicus' translation of the Odyssey into Latin. The first work that can be considered purely Latin literature is the epic poem, the Annales, by Ennius, which has as its focus Roman history. It is based on the historical records, the annals, that were kept every year. The year 146 BCE represents one of those fortuitous juxtapositions of events that take on special meaning from the rearview perspective of her history. In geopolitical terms, the destruction of Carthage appeared the more significant event, but the capture of the Greek city Corinth in the same year was in as many ways just as noteworthy. The Senate ordered Corinth to be razed and everything in it of value shipped off to Rome. Books were included in the booty acquired from Roman territorial expansion, including the sack of Corinth, and it was only Greek books that the Romans were after. Earlier, at the end of the Third Macedonian War in 168 BCE, the books of the royal library of the king of Macedon were brought to Rome, which must have constituted an enormous increase in the works available to the literate elite back in Italy. This was accompanied by Greek intellectuals who also came to Rome. This flow of intellectual property from east to west was steady throughout the remainder of the Republic, culminating in the last, most spectacular acquisition by Octavian in 30 BCE, the capture of Egypt and its riches. The growth of a culture of books in Roman society was accompanied by an increasing number of aspiring authors. By the 1st century BCE, literature, not only its consumption, but also its production, was an important part of an educated Roman's life. Much of the evidence comes from the letters of Cicero, a unique witness to the history of the Roman world. He tells us that his younger brother would spend his free time in army camps writing tragedies. And even as a young man, Julius Caesar himself and Octavian wrote tragedies. There was also a flourishing world of literary activity largely lost to us. Senators wrote political pamphlets and published speeches, and there were much less refined forms of literature like mime. We have no way of knowing how many people in the city of Rome or across the empire indulged in the habit of reading for pleasure. The Romans did not keep a track of literary statistics, nor do we have sales figures for best-selling books. What we know or can guess about the audience for literature has to be gleaned from other sources and from the anecdotal evidence of what the Romans wrote about themselves. The readership of these works also changed as Rome grew. The community of readers who first read Ennius' Annales was very different in many ways from that of Livy in Rome and the provinces much later. Literature in Rome started as an oral pursuit, which is why much early literature has been lost. The technology of book production must have been imported into Rome by the late 3rd century BCE, when works of literature began to be composed there in Latin writing. This is where I want to make an important distinction between the ancient conception of a book and our modern conception. When we talk about ancient texts, a book is actually more like a chapter. Ennius' epic poem, the Annales, was made up of 18 books. For a Roman, the basic act of reading a book involved holding a papyrus roll in 2 hands, unrolling it with the right hand while rolling up the finished portion with the left. The text was set out horizontally to the long edge of the roll, in columns typically about 2 to 4 inches wide. The writing itself was continuous, without separation of individual words, and texts were not punctuated. For the most part, only one side of the papyrus was written on, although it was not uncommon for the backside of a papyrus roll to be used for other things, like notes. Books were the only things printed on papyrus. Other materials were used for keeping records, writing first drafts, doing school lessons, composing letters, or drafting legal documents. These included wooden tablets, folded sheets made from bark that were sometimes strung together, or parchment from animal hides. Each book of a work would take up one papyrus roll. This means that Livy's vast history of 142 books was a box or shelf loaded with 142 different papyrus rolls. Romans provided themselves with books for their private enjoyment in libraries that soon became symbols of status. If the level of literacy in Rome during Augustus's reign was about 10%, as is often assumed by scholars, with the population of roughly 1 million, that would have meant about 100,000 people who might, in theory, buy a book. In reality, this number was probably even smaller. Most Romans divided their collections into separate sections for literature in Greek and literature in Roman, a circumstance that accounts for the discoveries at the best-known private library from the Roman world, the so-called Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum, a city just south of Pompeii that was also buried by the eruption of Vesuvius. You can see a picture of it on your screen now. The villa attracted an intellectual crowd, and the Greek library of the villa was quite advanced, and carbonized scrolls in Greek and Latin are still being excavated and read by lasers today. A wealthy Roman would have had his own specially trained staff of enslaved individuals to copy texts he needed, but there was also an industry of book selling. Book shops were concentrated on the street known as the Argiletum, which connected the Forum with the somewhat seamy district known as the Suburra. But there were also booksellers in the nearby Vicus Sandalarius, or the shoe shops quarter. And this book market was not limited to Rome. We know that there were books for sale in many of the cities of Italy as well as in the provinces. In addition to private libraries, there were also public libraries, not so grand as, say, the Great Library of Pergamum, which had 200,000 rolls, or the Library at Alexandria with more than 500,000, but still pretty big. The first library in Rome was inaugurated in 39 BCE by one of Caesar's lieutenants, Asinius Pollio. It was located in an ancient monument, the Atrium Libertatis, dedicated to the personified deity, freedom. But the place of literature in the Roman public life was cemented by Octavian when he completed a sumptuous temple to Apollo on the Palatine, adjacent to his home, and included in it a library with separate sections for Greek and Latin literature. As mentioned in the history lecture, patronage of literature was increasingly becoming primarily the job of the emperor, so that nothing so definitively singled out an author's rejection as the exclusion from the Palatine Library. Rome was a model in this for cities across the empire. Within the city, patronage was the exclusive prerogative of the emperor, but throughout the Roman world, local dignitaries erected public libraries for the betterment of their communities and the greater glory of their names. And subsequent emperors followed Augustus's suit, building public libraries of their own. By the early empire, it would seem that if one knew how to read and wanted a book, getting a hold of a copy was easy. The genres of these books varied widely, from more serious philosophy, tragedy, and epic, to technical literature on agriculture, astronomy, and grammar. Popular works also existed, such as fables, mimes, and sexy works. In an oral culture, the poet sings to his audience, or rather the muse sings through him, a song that he has heard from an older poet and passed down through the generations. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome was no longer primary an oral culture. The literature produced from this point on was intended for preservation in books, and so the expectations of the experience of a reading audience were integral to the aesthetics of composition. It used to be taken as a given that all, or almost all, of the reading in antiquity was done aloud, but there was never much evidence for that view. There is indeed considerable evidence that many people often did read aloud to themselves, or were read to by a professional reader, lector, an enslaved individual. But private study and silent reading were at least as common as reading aloud. This is what the younger Pliny was doing the night Vesuvius erupted. Literature was also a form of entertainment, at home and in public. Literary readings were common at dinner parties, and if your guests included a poet, you might arrange a recitation. Public recitations became common in the late Republic, and Ovid recalls hearing many of Rome's greatest poets. By the early empire, complaints about the ubiquity of poetry readings became a staple of satirical works. Readings of prose works, especially history and oratory, were also common. Now, before we move on to material culture, I want you to stop and think about the type of person who would have been writing this literature. With the exception of public libraries, libraries were brought into Rome by the Senate, which, as we learned from our history lecture, was made up of the aristocracy, or owned by a private citizen, who was also probably the aristocracy. Only men could participate in politics, and since writing became an important part of political life, the majority of the authors were men of the aristocracy who could hold political offices. All of the men who were writing had the free time to sit down and write, which meant they probably weren't working in a shop to make a living. They were wealthy. Thus, the majority of the literature we have was written by elite, wealthy men. In fact, there is only one example of writing by a woman, which we will be reading, and even she was elite and wealthy. While this literature could say things about the lower working classes, or women, or enslaved individuals, it does not represent their viewpoint. Even plays where characters from all sorts of backgrounds were depicted were written by elite, wealthy men, and therefore carried their biases. So where can we look to find other voices? This is where Pompeii and Ostia become super useful. They provide us with the material culture of the ancient Romans. Our best evidence for the daily life of Romans outside the upper aristocracies is in the excavated ruins of the cities of Campania destroyed by the eruption of Vesuvius. Before the discovery of Pompeii, scholars had a reasonable understanding of Roman history, where their conception of the Romans was heavily influenced by the existing evidence, which consisted primarily of literary texts and works of art, which present a view of Roman civilization that was skewed towards the experiences of the wealthy and the powerful. Early excavations were haphazard, with the goal of finding art to adorn private collections, rather than actually documenting the finds. However, when excavations became more systematic and careful, excavators began to realize the unprecedented nature of the evidence that had been preserved by the eruption. Much of our current understanding of Roman culture and civilization, and in particular our knowledge about the lives of ordinary citizens and non-elites, stems from the data recovered from Pompeii and nearby Herculaneum. The ash and volcanic flows preserve objects from daily life that have survived nowhere else in the Roman world. Wooden furniture, like this door from Herculaneum. Wall paintings, like these paintings from the very famous Villa of the Mysteries. Graffiti, which you can see here, are drawings of birds from a women's bath. Objects of daily life, such as these storage jars that were found all over Pompeii. Previously mentioned papyri, which we see here in actual evidence of, and even bodies of ancient inhabitants. This evidence, which has perished elsewhere, has done much to help us understand Roman civilization as a real living culture. The homes of merchants and merchant class citizenry of Pompeii, many of them quite humble, are decorated with scenes from mythology made famous in literature. Other homes are decorated with portraits of owners holding papyrus rolls or other writing implements, illustrating the prestige that was attached to the knowledge of literature. But the most lively testament to the literary pursuits of the people of Pompeii is the wealth of graffiti that covered the streets and public buildings. Scraps of poetry were scrawled all over the town: Ennius, Homer, Lucretius, Ovid, etc. But by far the most quoted was Virgil, who appears almost 50 times. One individual started to write the first line of Book 2 of the Aeneid on the wall of the brothel, but never got past the first word, probably because he was a little bit distracted. But more indicative of the penetration of literary culture outside the elite, perhaps, are the original poetic compositions found among the graffiti of Pompeii. Many of them love poems. The habit of writing poetry in public was so widespread that we find a graffito that writes, "I am amazed, wall, that you have not collapsed from having to carry the tedious scribblings of so many writers several times around town." As mentioned previously, we only have literature from one female writer, while the walls of Pompeii tell us that women too were taking part in literary production. The literary tradition includes a great many poems about lovers locked out from the house of their beloved. Here is an actual example of such a poem, affixed to the door of a house and written by a woman to another woman. "Oh, that I might entwine my arms about your neck, and with tender lips give you kisses. Go now, little girl, and trust your hopes to the winds. Little girl, trust me, fickle are the ways of men. Oft at the midnight hour, I, a poor girl, lay awake, musing thus with myself. Many whom fortune has exalted, these she now suddenly rejects and casts headlong down. So after love has suddenly joined the bodies of lovers, dawn separates them and a wall. Oh, what am I to do? While no graffiti exists from Ostia, its function as an industrial city gives us an even better glimpse into the lives of the lower to middle class Romans. At its height, Ostia probably had a population as high as 50,000, but by the early Middle Ages it had become a ghost town, and because of its malarial nature, the ancient city was never really resettled or built over. This has proven to be a great benefit to historians and archaeologists, since ancient Ostia is now one of the best preserved Roman sites. Because of its extensive rebuilding in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE, followed by its rapid decline, Ostia is also our best guide as to what imperial Rome would have looked like at its height, especially in terms of residential and commercial structures. Although Ostia suffered the same looting for statues, mosaics, and other works of art as most ancient cities, because it was never built over, the ruins of the city's buildings remained relatively untouched from the Renaissance to the present. However, just like with using literature as our only source of evidence for the ancient world, material culture has some drawbacks. First and foremost, most things that are left to us are anonymous. Sometimes names exist on things found inside of homes in Pompeii and Ostia. That's true, but a pan or a wall painting or a statue cannot tell us the identity of the person who made it or purchased it. Graffiti may seem to be the solution to this problem, but a lot of anonymity exists here too. Graffiti can only tell us the identity of the person who wrote it if they name themselves or use gendered grammar. Latin does have different endings for different genders, so sometimes you can tell, based on what they wrote, what their gender is. For example, there's a graffiti that exists that says, "I baked bread today," but there's no way to tell who baked the bread. In contrast, the poem From the Woman to the Other Woman we just discussed has female grammatical endings for both the writer of the poem and the recipient of the poem, so we know that the two people in question were female. We also don't know what has been lost to time or looting or shoddy excavations at these sites. Looting was a huge problem when archaeology began to get popular, and many excavations were started for the purpose not of recording what was found there, but to be the first to find highly coveted statues and artwork for private collections. In this rush to get the good stuff, the things that could have told us more about daily life were either not recorded or discarded in favor of more grand items.